All right. Hey, folks. So today I want to speak about deloads. Now, right from the off, I just want to talk a bit about what I'm going to cover in this, because I know for a fact there are going to be a number of people who are going to dismiss this because they'll say things like, I let life dictate when to deload me. I'm going to explain in this video why that's completely incorrect. You're wrong. Okay. And I'm going to explain why. I'm going to explain why that's not actually a deload. Feel free to watch. Dispute me if you want to, but you're wrong. I'm right. And the next one that people say to detract regular deloads, planned deloads, is people say, I deload when I feel like I need to. I let my body tell me. And again, I'm going to prove to you why that's wrong and I'm right. If you are interested in discussion, feel free to carry on and listen to what I'm actually saying before you attempt to refute it. If you're not interested in discussion, then you can't be helped. So click off by all means. Now, just to lay out then what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk about deloads, my own experience, the biological basis for them. This is very much an open conversation. I might come back to this in a part 2 because I may have missed things. But just once again, before I continue with the rest of this, if you are going to try and detract from this, like, have some self-respect, actually listen to the argument and then make a rebuttal based on the argument. Don't just blurt words onto the screen, because that means nothing. First of all, I want to discuss my experience. Now, years ago, I was very pro deload, and I want to just explain to you why. Because I think if you understand why I was pro deload, you will understand why I'm bringing this topic up. I want to explain to you my own experience, and I think you will understand why I was so pro deload for a long time. Back in 2003, take you way back. Let me take you to a trip down memory lane. Okay, back in 2003, the internet and the world hadn't really heard of deloads. Back then, some people mistakenly called them unloads, and there were various. It was very new, essentially. It was a very new term. Now, back in 2003, I was a up-and-coming, budding powerlifter. Right, I wanted to be big and strong. I still had the goals to hit the big three-plate bench, 4-plate squat, 5-plate deadlift. I hadn't hit those goals yet. I was at the point where I was benching about 200 pounds, 90 kilos-ish. I was squatting about 150 kilos, so 330 pounds. And I was deadlifting, I think, about 480, 490, so about 5 plates. Okay. So I got to that point with no idea of deloads, just essentially working on relatively sensible routines. But I was stuck. And bear in mind, I want to just make out from the beginning, I've been accused of having a sort of a perspective on training which comes from an athlete. And I don't think that's true now, because I've been a coach for 10 years and I have a much more broad experience. But certainly at the time, that was my only thought process. I was an athlete. All I wanted to do was get stronger. I had tried everything. Okay. My diet was good enough to progress. I played around with my training. I'd done more volume. I'd done less volume, and I was at a wall. I remember trying the Small-Off Junior routine. Got a bit of gains. Once I came off it, gains came back down, or I got hurt or something. Just nothing worked for multiple years. Okay. And I was massively stuck. And I was getting to the point where I'd been asking people online, I'd been consulting with what I considered to be authorities back then, who basically told me, look, your genetics suck. That's it. You're stuck. Like, you're done. Okay. I remember messaging Dan John. Now, you all know Dan John. He's still around. And I messaged Dan John one afternoon. And to my surprise, he got back to me within 3 hours. I mean, I was starstruck. This big American influencer coach replied back to me within hours. I was just some dumb kid from England, and I was very excited. But Dan had a lot of good things to say. And he said to me, why don't you go through your logs? So I had paper logs for many years, 7, 8 years of paper logs. Go through your logs and try and figure out when things go to shit. So when do you get injured? When do you get ill? When do you get hurt? Like, when does it happen? Is there a pattern there? And Dan wasn't suggesting anything to me. He just said, look, try and find a pattern. So I said, okay, not really knowing what to expect, because again, deloads were not in the vocabulary then. I mean, try and think of that. No one did them. It just wasn't a thing. So I said, yeah, actually, Dan, I can see clear as day. Look through my logs, trawl through everything, and I could see it. Every 3rd week, something would happen. I would either get hurt, I would get injured, or I would just stall. I remember working so hard that on the third week, I would go in as a 5-plate deadlifter, not even be able to pull 2.5 plates from the ground. I was just so burnt out. That's real. That's just me being real. Obviously, I hadn't lost 100 kilos of strength in a week, but that was what was happening. So I wrote back to him and I said, Dan, this is it. And he said, okay, what I want you to do is preempt that. Don't change anything about your training. Just preempt that. And just every third week, go light. And he laid out some specifications on how to go light. So me as what was I back then? 21 years old, something like that. I said, okay, great. I'll do it, Dan. Thank you very much for the help. Now, understand, and this is the crux of why I was so into deloads for a long time. Understand this. Just listen to this. Over the course of the next 18 months, I went from a 90 kilo, 200-pound bench to a 150 or 330-pound bench. Just let that sink in. At the same body weight. Just let that sink in for a second. And yeah, I was a little bit soft. I was a little bit fat. You guys know my background at the beginning. I grew muscle. I hardened up. I actually looked like I lifted for the first time over those 18 months because my bench went up from 200 pounds to 330 pounds. My squat went from 150 kilos, about 330 pounds, to the peak of 227 kilos, which is 500 pounds. Just let that sink in. And my deadlift went from 220 to about 235. Okay. That was already quite good on the deadlift, so a 15 kilo increase. That was over the course of 18 months. It was the most productive 18 months I've ever had. And finally, in year 5, I think it was, I had sealed the deal as what I considered to be an advanced lifter. I looked jacked, I lifted well, and finally I was handling 3 plates on the bench pretty easily. 4 plates on a squat was child's play. I was squatting 5. Deadlift was well over 5 plates at this stage. So I was sold. That was it. Understandably. Why wouldn't I believe it? Because this is the thing. What could I possibly read which could convince me that what I did then was wrong? Tell me, what could I possibly read? What science, what evidence, what influencer could possibly tell me, look, those 18 months where you gained over 100 pounds on your bench, over 100 pounds on your squat, were wrong? Because reality is important. What actually happens in reality is massively important, not what some theory says. What do I always say on this channel? Your only loyalty is to your results. Why would I have a loyalty to anything else apart from that? Because that worked. And all I was interested in was improving. I didn't care about being right online. I didn't care about going to YouTube and going, you're wrong. I wasn't interested in that. Imagine that. Imagine those gains. Imagine if you actually got those gains. You'd be sold. Of course you would. So was I. So that was my experience. And I found the crux of the situation for me was to make the improvements that I needed to make to push past those plateaus. I needed to do a level of work, both intensity and volume, which was not sustainable in the long term. That was the crux of it. I'd gotten to a point in my development where to push harder for longer, that was the only thing that was going to actually grow me. Now, you could maybe say to me, hey, Faz, you must have had pretty shit genetics then. Yeah, I probably did. I probably do. I don't think I have special genetics. I think I've had to learn a hell of a lot over the course of my lifetime. But I got to the point where to improve further, and yeah, maybe I hit that point quite early, to improve further, the level of work in intensity and volume that I needed to improve me was more than I could sustain for 2 weeks at a time. So every third week I would deload, which would usually be a light week, or what was quite good for me was having half a week off completely, the first half of the week off, and then reintroducing exercise slowly over the last half week. And then the next week would begin another 3-week cycle, 2 weeks of just going balls to the wall. And it was balls to the wall in terms of intensity and volume, huge amounts of everything, to the point where I was crushed. That was my explanation of why it worked. I had gotten to the point where the amount of work that I needed to really grow muscle was more than I could sustain for more than 2 weeks at a time. Now, my cycle was like 3 weeks, 2 weeks heavy, 1 week light or off. For somebody else, it might be different. Nobody back then who I knew was doing 3-week cycles. No one. Okay. And when I said that, I remember saying that to a pro strongman over here. he said, that sounds crazy. You're basically deloading for a third of your life. And I was like, yeah, but look at the results. I don't care about how much time I'm resting. I don't care about how much work I need to do. I don't care about any of that. I was desperate to improve. That's all I cared about. Again, I didn't care about being right, being wrong, about doing more, doing less. I was desperate to improve. You've got to bear in mind, this was 20 years ago. I was full on competitive mode. I didn't care about what I had to sacrifice. If I had to be in the gym 2 weeks out of every third week, I didn't care. It didn't bother me. No matter how much work I had to do in the gym over those 2 weeks, it didn't bother me. I did it because that's what I needed to do to improve. And I tried everything else at that point. So that's the first section. That is my experience. I want to just delve into a bit of sort of general thoughts about this. The first thing I think, which kind of builds upon the reason that I thought it worked, which was that at some point you need to do a high enough amount of work, that is both intensity and volume and frequency, where that's not sustainable in the long term. And I think that's actually the same way in which we adapt to most things in life. Yeah. The same way you adapt to most things in life. I think, let's take a very common example. Let's take tanning. Okay. I can go out in a reasonable dose per day, right? Let's say in the summertime. Okay. I can go out for maybe half an hour, 20 minutes a day, and I'll slowly get a tan. And I might not even need a break. But at some point, those 20 and 30 minutes will get to the point where I'm no longer adapting. Now, I've got a couple of choices at that point. I can either get out there for longer, okay, but that's going to have a limit. At some point, bad things are going to happen, okay? You're going to get nastiness. At the extreme end, you might get like dry skin, peeling, all that kind of stuff. And at that point, you need to back off and go again. Every single mechanism in the body is based upon this cyclical nature of pushing for improvement, backing off, letting the gains consolidate, and then going to a new high. And important to note here is none of this applies to people who are still at the beginning rung of any endeavor. So a lot of detractors are just not big enough or strong enough. The reality is, if you're still benching a beginner amount, as un-PC as this is, you don't get to have a say in this. You're a beginner. Know your role, know your place. When the big boys are talking, let them talk and learn something. But back to what I was saying, most mechanisms in the body do work via this process once you're past the beginner stage. To continue to make the adaptations you need to make to improve, you need to push very hard to the point where things might almost start to break and then back down. Over time, the body is amazing at adaptation. Adaptation is integral in humans, right? But we generally tend to do it in stages. So we adapt for a bit, we back off, let it consolidate. You get a little bit detrained, in this case, then you push again. And it's due to this predicament. That is, the amount of work you need to do to improve is more than what you can recover from on a long-term basis. So you have to do it short-term, then back off. Short-term again, and back off. It's a series of steps. It's not a general line across where you just continue to improve. If you can do that, if you can continue to improve, great, cool. You're either a beginner or you're a guy with very good genetics, far better than I had. To give you an example of this, there was a guy called Bob Bernarski, who was one of America's best ever weightlifters back in the day. He was on the Olympic team when Bill Starr was the head coach, so 60s. He was said to have used one routine his entire life, the same 3 to 5 day routine he did as a beginner, the way to the point where he was at the Olympics, same thing. Now that's a guy with just incredible genetics for the sport. And all he did was the same thing over and over again, and it just helped. But to make that type of strength possible for everyone, you need far more complicated periodization schemes. And I think throughout the 20 years that I've been active on in the internet and forums and stuff, I think there has been this push for complexity and then this recoil away from that. Now people are more interested in simplicity because there's a lot of complicated bullshit out there, and I understand. But we can't let our emotions get in the way of what might benefit us. So the second point is that most mechanisms in the body work via this type of cycling. Okay? The body works in cycles. It has a cyclical nature. Okay. Now, those are the first two talking points. I now want to go into the sort of common detractions. So if you've waited this long to hear this because you're one of those guys who've immediately said, no, I just let my body dictate where to deload. Now is your time to listen up so that you can understand what I'm saying. Now, this whole thing about I let life dictate to me when to deload, these guys don't really seem to understand the concept that I've laid out here. And hopefully, by the time we've got to this point in the video, assuming you've not just skipped ahead, you've started to understand why what you're saying doesn't apply to the conversation. In fact, I don't even really want to call what you do a deload. That's not a deload in the sense that I know of it as a deload. A deload is, like I say, you push things more than you can recover from in a long-term or even medium-term basis, which forces you to deload because you're trying to take advantage of this stress, recuperation, adaptation cycle. Letting life dictate to you when to deload, that's not even a deload. That's just called taking a break. The level of work you're doing is still supposed to be, for you, sustainable, but just life gets in the way. Your life just shits the bed every however many weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, and you take a break. That's just called taking a break. That's all it is. All you've done there is just taken a break. You've let your life get out of hand. Or the shit's just hit the fan. Maybe something's happened with your kids, maybe your wife. All the typical nuclear family kind of thing has happened, and you're just taking a break. Don't call that a deload. Don't try and sound all fancy. That's not a deload. It's just you taking a break because life's taking a shit on you. That's all it is. That's not a deload. That's a break. Let's call that what it is. It's not a deload. It's a break. Your life is chaotic. It's unpredictable. You took a break. Great. You don't need to call it a deload. Don't try and act like it's a complicated periodized thing. That's not what we're discussing here. And we need to get that out there because that is completely different to what I'm talking about here, which is a planned deload, taking advantage of the high levels of work you're doing to allow you to do more, which is what you need to do at this certain point to recover. It's a strategy. The deload that I'm talking about is a strategy. It's a strategy of pushing the body beyond its medium to long-term recovery capabilities so that you can pull back and take advantage of the supercompensation. So for you bros, right, firstly, you've got no argument, okay? Secondly, if your life is that chaotic, rather than spending time listening to this video and writing down detracting comments, which are wrong, by the way, I'm right, spend some time sorting out your life. That's what I would advise. Now, the next sort of detraction I want to say is people say, look, I know my body. I deload when I need to because I know my body. The implication being that somebody like me doesn't know my body. Now, my 2 points about this are, first of all, look, if you know your body, you can predict the deload. It's quite simple. I settled on a 2-week heavy, 1-week light basis because I know my body. Your body, you can easily set up a schedule. That's how much does your body change from week to week? Like seriously, are you some kind of chameleon? Are you some kind of space invader that your body just morphs into different things from week to week? It's so chaotic. No, you're a human being. Okay. When you say to me, look, I deload when I need to, what you're basically saying is my life is so chaotic and so unorganized and so messed up that I have no idea whether I'm coming or going. Again, what I would say to you is this is not the video for you then. Get your life in order. Get off internet. Get off YouTube. Go sort your life out. You don't need this. This is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about planned deloads with people who are dedicated and actually know their bodies. That's what we're talking about. To take advantage of that supercompensation. We're not talking about guys whose lives are just so unpredictable. 1 week they're doing this, next week they're doing that, next week everything's way off. That's not this. That's just called not having your life in order. That's all it is. So some people say, yeah, they deload when they need to because they know their body, or like sometimes they might need to deload every 3 weeks or every 7 weeks. They can't predict it. Which to my answer to that would be, how unpredictable is your life? I would hate that. God, that sounds terrible. How unpredictable is your life that you cannot even determine when you need to deload, like every 3 weeks or every 7 weeks? Again, if your life is that messed up, just fix your life. Get off YouTube, fix your life. Like, this is a discussion for big boys. This is a discussion for serious people. Listen, I make plenty of videos for casuals, so maybe go watch one of those. So that point, which is related to the whole, I let life dictate to me when to deload, I don't agree with. Now, you may think I'm being a little bit spicy with these takes, only because I've seen these arguments over and over again, and a lot of them are just done by casuals. But The problem that I always have with stuff like that is, because I've had this over the years many times, people always say, why complicate things? But it's always mediocre people who say that. My response to that is always, why are you wasting time on YouTube if your life is just so much better than that? You're like, hey, dude, who's got time for all this? Why do you have time to sit in the YouTube comments bash on and on about it? If that's not your thing, if that's not your thing, go do what you do. Go, what? Maybe I'm talking to James Bond. Go do some skydiving, jump out of a rocket or something, and rescue some woman and kill terrorists. I don't know what you do. If that's your life, cool, you do that. This is a video for serious sports. And again, I make plenty of videos for casual, so feel free to go watch one of those. But the type of guys who always go into these comments saying, oh, I'm too busy for all that, why complicate things? Fine, bro, go do something else. Why are you here? Fuck off. I don't get it. I really don't get. Now, the next sort of detraction, this is probably the start of, I think, one of the better detractions. So this is this idea that deloads are for strength and not for hypertrophy. I think this is actually a good talking point. It's a sensible one. So I've heard this from a lot of people over the years, and this idea that deloads are born from sports education, like powerlifting, strength sports, rather than bodybuilding. And as a result, we don't really see it in the literature. Now, I will say that's true, but that's not the reason why these things might not be applicable from a hypertrophy point of view. We have a lot of research from strength sports, a lot, going back to the 60s and 70s, and because there's a lot of money on the line. There's also a lot of rivalry between countries, right? So there's been a lot of focus on how do our guys win in the Olympics and beat the others, right? There's been a lot of that. There's been a lot of focus on this. So deloads have been in the literature for that reason, because it has been identified via working with millions of high-level athletes that they are an advantageous strategy for strength. And so the logical conclusion is people say, well, there's no research about it on hypertrophy, so it doesn't apply. But why would it not apply? No one has yet provided me with a good reason as to why it wouldn't apply. I think the research just isn't there because hypertrophy is still a new field. And let's face it, the last 10 years of hypertrophy have been an absolute shit show. Schoenfeld. So that I think is why we don't have a great deal. But there's no telling that some might not come out over the course of the next maybe 10 or 20 years if things can get cleaned up a little bit. So I think there's just a lack of research in the area. That's what I think. Yes, it hasn't. I don't believe it's been proven for hypertrophy, but it doesn't mean it's not valid. And there's no reason why it wouldn't be. Like, why would it not be valid? It doesn't make any sense. We're still talking about humans and adaptation cycles. Now, there's one possible reason which I think might be brought forward, which I want to address. People will say strength sports are by definition harder on connective tissues and also more lift specific. So you get a lot more neural issues as well, which I think is a good point. I believe I heard NH made that point fairly recently. Natural hypertrophy. I like him. I respect him. Good guy. And I think he made that point. I do think he's wrong because I don't think that's a strong enough assertion for what we're discussing here. It makes sense on the surface. Heavy lifting takes more of a toll on the connective tissues, and also there's a neurological element because you're repeatedly doing the same lift over and over again. But to that, I would still say, look, there are about 3 main mechanisms we need to worry about, which for recovery in any time we train, right? The muscles, which recover rapidly, the connective tissues, which recover slower, and then the neural network, which can also recover relatively slow depending on what you're doing. So those are the ones we need to really worry about. But the thing is, they just have different recovery times. It doesn't actually change the way we need to approach training. It's still the same concept. It's just different systems. It doesn't mean they react differently. There's no evidence to suggest they would react differently. There's no evidence to suggest that they wouldn't still respond from this same stress, adaptation, supercompensation cycle, which may well be necessary to get you from where you are now to past, again, based on the principle of at some point, the amount of work you need to do is going to exceed what you are able to recover from on a medium to long-term basis. It's the same point again. So I think that point, which I'm gonna say it's NH's point just because it's easy to reference. So NH's point there, I think, is the most sensible of the potential detractions. But I don't think it holds any water because we're still talking about adaptive mechanisms in the body. And this, so I don't think there's any reason why we would have to exclude things from the hypertrophy perspective. And I'd also say, just to back that up, if you look at some of the more successful powerlifting programs, which do a lot less powerlifting specific work and a lot more bodybuilding, take Westside Barbell, for example. Probably 90% of that is bodybuilding work. Maybe 10% is a combination of singles and then the speed work. But a whole lot of that is just bodybuilding work. It's literally conjugate. Conjugate is bodybuilding, essentially. Louis Simmons said the same thing himself when he was alive. You know, conjugate is bodybuilding. All they do is they do some singles on top of that to retain strength efficiency as well as some speed work. But essentially, it's all year bodybuilding specific work. And they work in 3-week cycles, just like I did. So that, I think, is probably the most impactful point, but I still think it's wrong. Now, the final point I want to say about this is, if you manage to get this far, you're probably relatively serious about trying a deload and looking at this. I will say, look, most people probably don't need to deload. This is why I don't do it a lot with the majority of my clients, because the majority of my clients are beginners to intermediates and they don't necessarily need it. Also, there's a practical component. A lot of guys don't have the time necessary to put in the level of work which is unsustainable. A lot of guys might also not have the mindset necessary to push through those weeks, because they're hard weeks, to need to rest within the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th week. So most people don't need to deload. So if you're very swayed by this, and I do understand I can be quite persuasive, you have to take a serious look at where you are. Are you making progress? If you're not making progress, don't automatically assume it's because you need to deload. Okay. I would assume first that your diet is not on par, your rest isn't great, you're not pushing hard enough in the gym, maybe you're not doing enough volume. Figure those things out first. And that takes a good degree of honesty. It takes a good degree of humility to work that out. I tried everything when I was stuck at those numbers, everything. I just desperately wanted to improve. There was nothing else left for me to try. Nothing. And I wasn't going to go enhanced. I had nothing to lose. I gave Dan John's advice a good go. It worked. And it catapulted me from being essentially a guy with pretty mediocre genetics, pretty fat, to an absolute stud in a year and a half. And then beyond that as well. A lot of this, it comes back to, I think, the point that I made at the beginning was, if you had gotten the results that I had, would you not defend deloads? I think you would, despite what the science is telling you or what some influencers are telling you. If you gained 130 pounds on your bench press in 18 months, after being an intermediate for years, being a sold, if you put on an additional 170 pounds on your squat over the course of 18 months, would you not be convinced? If you put on God knows how much muscle in that time frame without really gaining a lot of body fat, would you not be convinced? So you can't ignore reality. I think there's a plague of people having what I refer to as lifting amnesia, both on YouTube and beyond that, where they just forget about what has worked because science says otherwise. I would also say the guys who say, let life dictate to you when to deload, or I deload when I need to, you just don't really understand what I'm saying here. That's not a deload. That's just called taking a break. And it's okay to take a break. I'm not dogging on you. Yeah, if your life goes to shit, go take a break. Fine. Go take a break. Go take a spa day. Go rest, relax, pamp yourself a little bit. Right? But that's not the discussion we're having here today. I never used to feel relaxed on a deload. I would feel battered because I had done enough work to justify it. I wasn't just taking a break because life got in the way. I forced that break. So that is not a valid criticism. And finally, I'll call it the NH's criticism. It's a good one, but I don't think it really holds water, because these adaptations in the body are all very similar. They're just based on different time frames. There's nothing to suggest that it needs to be different. And the lack of research in the area is not a valid criticism. We just don't have a lot of hypertrophy research. And what we do have over the last 10 years has been, well, I'm going to call it there. Interesting discussion, I think. May end up to be a two-parter, who knows? I think what I would like to see from this discussion is some actual intelligent conversation, okay? I think if you're going to start rapping about, oh, I just take a break when I need to, I know my body, that's just spare me. It's just basically shouting out you have a low IQ, just spare me, okay? I have plenty of videos for beginners. I have plenty of videos on mindset and motivation. This is not that, okay? So just, if that's you, just have some humility. That's not what it's about. Deloads are a very specific part of a strategy. And I'd love to hear from people who have more thoughts in that area. Folks, I'm going to call it there. Have a great weekend. See you in the next one. Peace out.